And I fought for Korea. And my country paid me to kill nukes. Hey!
Was I out of my mind doing this scene? I should have asked for a stunt double. Those words, reportedly spoken by Vic Morrow just before performing one of the most dangerous scenes of his career, would become hauntingly prophetic moments before tragedy struck. On the fateful night of July 23, 1982 in California, Morrow was filming Twilight Zone the movie, a film that would not be released until 1983. He played Bill Connor, a deeply prejudiced man who was suddenly forced to experience discrimination from the perspective of those he had once despised. Toward the end of the story, his character is transported back to the Vietnam War, where he attempts to save 2 children. Then, something went terribly wrong. A helicopter was flying dangerously low near the actors while explosions were being detonated for the scene. Suddenly, the aircraft lost control. Within seconds, Vic Morrow and the 2 young actors were killed. Morrow was only 53 years old.
But why was such a dangerous scene allowed to happen in the first place? Why were children placed in such a hazardous situation? To understand this tragedy, we have to go further back, not to the final night of his life, but to Morrow's early years. Because behind that shocking ending was a long and difficult journey. A young man who escaped an uncertain childhood, accidentally discovered acting, struggled against Hollywood's tendency to cast him as a villain, and eventually became one of the most memorable war heroes in American television. This is the story of Vic Morrow. Not simply the story of how he died, but the story of how he lived, struggled, succeeded, and left behind a legacy that Hollywood would never forget. Part 2. July 23, 1982. An accident, or a disaster that could have been prevented. It was late at night on July 23, 1982, at Indian Dunes in California. The set was being prepared for one of the most difficult scenes in Twilight Zone, the movie. It was dark. The scene was set during the Vietnam War, and the production called for explosions, fire, and a helicopter flying low over the ground. Vic Morrow stood before the cameras. Beside him were 2 young performers, Renee Shin-Chen, 7, and Micah Din Lei, 6. The scene was supposed to show Morrow's character, Bill Connor, trying to protect the children. But as the cameras rolled, the atmosphere became increasingly dangerous. The helicopter moved low above the actors while special effects explosions were being triggered nearby. Everything had to happen at precisely the right moment. Then, suddenly, something went wrong. The helicopter lost control. Within moments, the carefully planned sequence had become a real-life tragedy. Vic Morrow and the 2 children were killed. There were no second chances, no opportunity to reshoot the scene, no way to rewrite what had happened. And almost immediately, the most difficult questions began. Who was responsible? Was this simply a terrible accident caused by circumstances that no one could have predicted? Or had too many risks been accepted before the cameras ever started rolling? Questions also arose about the presence of the 2 children. Why were children being used in a nighttime scene involving a helicopter, explosions, and other dangerous effects? The circumstances surrounding their participation became especially controversial because California's child labor rules placed restrictions on when and how young performers could work. And then there was the question of safety. Had the risks been properly discussed? Had warnings been taken seriously? Could the sequence have been filmed differently? Could the helicopter have been kept farther away? Could the special effects have been redesigned? Could the children have been kept away from the most dangerous elements? And perhaps the hardest question of all, could someone have simply said, stop? The investigation that followed examined the decisions made by director John Landis, the production team, the helicopter crew, and others involved in the filming. Landis and several others were eventually charged with involuntary manslaughter. The case became one of the most closely watched trials in Hollywood history concerning safety on a film set. Yet the courtroom did not produce a simple answer. After years of investigation and legal proceedings, the defendants were acquitted of the criminal charges. But an acquittal did not erase the questions. For many people in the film industry, the tragedy became a painful reminder that special effects are not simply images on a screen. Behind every explosion, every aircraft, and every dangerous stunt are real human beings. Vic Morrow had spent his entire career portraying men facing impossible situations. On that night, he was no longer playing a soldier.
He was simply an actor on a film set, and a father of 2 daughters who would never see him again. The tragedy left Hollywood with a question that could not easily be answered. When does a scene stop being realistic and become simply too dangerous to film? Vic Morrow died, but Hollywood could never go back to the way it was. The tragedy of July 23, 1982 did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. For Vic Morrow, his life and career were over in an instant. But for Hollywood, the consequences of that night would continue for years. The accident triggered intense investigations and a highly controversial legal battle. Director John Landis and several others involved in the production were eventually charged with involuntary manslaughter. The case raised difficult questions that went far beyond one film. Who should be held responsible when a dangerous scene goes wrong? Was it enough for... And when children were involved, should the standard for safety have been even higher? After a lengthy trial, Landis and the other defendants were ultimately acquitted of the criminal charges. Legally, the case had reached its conclusion. But morally, the questions never disappeared. For many people in the film industry, the tragedy became a lasting warning about the risks that could be hidden behind the phrase movie magic. A scene might last only a few seconds on screen, but creating those seconds could involve real aircraft, real explosions, real performers, and real danger. The tragedy also contributed to renewed attention towards safety procedures on film sets and the protection of child performers, particularly when productions involved dangerous effects or stunts. Hollywood would continue to evolve. But perhaps the most important legacy of Vic Morrow is not found in the courtroom. It is found in the characters he left behind. There was Artie West in the Blackboard Jungle, the troubled and intimidating young man who helped establish Morrow as a powerful screen presence. Then came Sergeant Chip Saunders in Combat, the role that transformed him from a man Hollywood often wanted to see as a villain into a dependable hero remembered by an entire generation. Morrow also wanted more than acting. He explored directing because he wanted greater control over the stories he helped create. He wanted to challenge himself, rather than remain trapped inside the image Hollywood had built around him. And beyond the screen, he was also the father of Jennifer Jason Leigh, who would later establish her own respected career as an actress. His family life was complicated, and his personal relationships remain a more complicated part of his story than the heroic characters he portrayed on television. Perhaps that is what makes Vic Morrow's life so fascinating. He was not simply a hero. He was not simply a villain. He was an ambitious actor who struggled, succeeded, made mistakes, built a family, pursued new creative challenges, and continued searching for something more even after achieving fame. And that brings us back to the greatest irony of all. Vic Morrow spent his entire career trying to prove that he was more than a face Hollywood could use to play dangerous men. He became a hero. He became a director. He became a father. He became an actor capable of far more than the roles he was first given. Yet, in the end, much of the world remembers him because of one tragic scene that he never had the chance to finish. Perhaps that is the saddest part of Vic Morrow's story. He spent a lifetime trying to define his own legacy, and one unfinished scene came to define how history remembered him. Part 4. The husband, the father, and the relationships that fractured his family. Behind the image of Sergeant Chip Saunders was another Vic Morrow, one the television audience rarely saw. In 1957, Morrow married actress and screenwriter Barbara Turner. For a time, they appeared to be a promising Hollywood family, both working in the entertainment industry while building a life together.
They eventually had 2 daughters, Carrie Ann and Jennifer Jason Leigh. Jennifer would later become a highly respected actress in her own right, establishing a career that would prove she was far more than simply the daughter of a famous actor. But behind the appearance of a successful Hollywood family, the marriage between Morrow and Turner was not destined to last. The couple eventually divorced, and their relationship became one of the more complicated chapters of Morrow's personal life. This is also where his story becomes difficult to tell with certainty. Some accounts of the marriage describe serious disagreements and the deeply troubled relationship. Barbara Turner herself later spoke about her experiences with Morrow, including her perspective on the difficulties within their marriage. But there is an important distinction to make. A personal account is not automatically the same thing as an established fact. When looking back at a relationship that ended decades ago, especially one involving 2 people who experienced the same events differently, it is important to separate documented facts from personal recollections and accusations. What is clear is that the marriage ended, and the family moved forward separately. For Jennifer Jason Leigh, growing up in a family shaped by divorce and Hollywood could not have been simple. Her relationship with her father was also complicated. As Jennifer grew older, she pursued acting herself. Eventually, she established a remarkable career and became known for performances that demonstrated the same kind of intensity and commitment that had characterized her father's work. In some ways, her career became another chapter in Vic Morrow's legacy. But success did not necessarily erase the complicated emotions surrounding their relationship. And this raises a question that is perhaps more uncomfortable than any controversy surrounding Morrow's career. How can a man be remembered as a hero by millions of viewers while his role as a husband and father remains far more complicated behind closed doors? On television, Morrow could portray courage, leadership, and sacrifice. At home, however, he was simply a human being. He could make mistakes, he could disappoint people, he could struggle with relationships in ways that an audience watching combat would never see. That contrast is important because celebrities are often remembered through the characters they played. Millions of viewers knew Sergeant Saunders. They knew the tough voice, the determined expression, and the soldier who seemed to know what to do when everything went wrong. But Barbara Turner knew the husband. Jennifer Jason Leigh knew the father. And those versions of Vic Morrow could not always fit neatly with the heroic image on television. Perhaps that is what makes his story more human. Vic Morrow was neither simply a hero nor simply a troubled man. He was both a talented artist and a complicated person, capable of great achievement while carrying imperfections that fame could never erase. And just as his family life became increasingly complicated, another question was beginning to occupy Morrow's mind. Was acting enough? Or was it finally time for him to step behind the camera and take control of his own stories? Part 2. The Bronx Boy Who Wanted to Escape an Ordinary Life. Before Vic Morrow became a familiar face on American television, before audiences knew him as Sergeant Chip Saunders, he was simply a boy growing up in the Bronx. Morrow was born on February 14, 1929, in the Bronx, New York City. His early years were shaped by difficult circumstances, and life did not offer him an obvious path toward fame or success. Like many young people growing up during that era, Morrow faced a future that seemed uncertain. There was no guarantee that he would ever leave his neighborhood, let alone become a Hollywood actor. School was not a place where Morrow found his direction. As a teenager, he eventually dropped out of high school and joined the United States Navy. It was a decision that might have appeared like an escape from one uncertain future into another, but the Navy became an important turning point. After leaving military service, Morrow used the GI Bill to continue his education. He traveled to Florida and enrolled in college, initially planning to study law. For a young man who had left high school without knowing exactly where his life was heading, this seemed like a sensible and respectable choice. Perhaps he would become a lawyer. Perhaps he would build a stable career and leave his difficult early years behind. But then, something unexpected happened.
While attending college, Morrow was given an opportunity to take part in a university stage production. It was only a role in a college play, but for Morrow, it became something much bigger. Standing on stage, he discovered a feeling that he had apparently never experienced in the classroom. He could step into another character, explore another personality, and communicate with an audience. For the first time, acting did not feel like a hobby. It felt like a possibility. And that possibility forced Morrow to reconsider everything he had planned. Could acting really become his future? Could a young man from the Bronx, who had already left high school and served in the Navy, actually build a career in the world of theater and film? Morrow decided to take the risk.
He abandoned his plans for a career in law and eventually left Florida for New York City, where he began seriously pursuing acting. New York offered no guarantees. He was entering a fiercely competitive world filled with young performers chasing the same dream. Every audition could end in rejection. Every small role could be forgotten. But Morrow kept going. He studied acting, gained experience on stage, and gradually began building the foundation of a professional career. The journey was still far from Hollywood. He had not yet become the tough, intimidating actor audiences would later recognize. He had not yet played Artie West. He had not yet become Sergeant Chip Saunders. And he certainly could not have imagined that one day millions of people would know his face. At this point, however, one thing had changed forever. Vic Morrow had finally discovered what he wanted to become. The boy from the Bronx had chosen a path that offered no certainty, no guarantee of fame, and no promise of success. But it gave him something far more important, a chance to define his own life. And soon Hollywood would discover that the young actor from New York had a face it could never easily forget. Part 3. From Hollywood's face of danger to the hero of combat. In 1955, Vic Morrow took a major step forward in his career when he appeared in The Blackboard Jungle as Artie West. The role immediately attracted attention. Morrow had an intense presence that made Artie West convincing as a troubled and dangerous young man. His performance helped introduce him to a much wider audience and opened the door to Hollywood. But success came with an unexpected price. Hollywood began to see Morrow as the kind of actor who could naturally play dangerous men, criminals, thugs, tough police officers, angry and unpredictable characters. The more convincing he became in those roles, the more often producers wanted him to play them. It was a familiar problem in Hollywood. An actor could become successful because of a certain image, only to find that the same image eventually limited his career. For Morrow, the question became increasingly difficult. Could he ever escape the face that Hollywood had given him? He wanted audiences to see more than a threatening expression or a character capable of violence. He wanted to prove that he could portray complexity, courage, loyalty, and humanity. Then, in 1962, the opportunity came. Morrow was cast as Sergeant Chip Saunders in the television series Combat. Everything changed. Set during World War II, Combat followed American soldiers fighting across Europe and explored the fear, exhaustion, loyalty, and moral challenges of war. At the center of the series was Sergeant Saunders. He was tough, but he was not simply a stereotypical action hero. Saunders carried responsibility for the men around him. He had to make difficult decisions, confront danger, and continue moving forward even when there seemed to be no easy answer. And Morrow brought a quiet intensity to the character that audiences remembered. The man Hollywood had once used to play villains was suddenly playing a soldier viewers could trust. Combat ran from 1962 to 1967, becoming one of the important American television dramas of its era. For Morrow, it was more than another successful acting job. It was a transformation of his public image. In 1963, he received a Primetime Emmy nomination for his performance as Sergeant Saunders, recognition that confirmed how far he had traveled from the threatening young actor of The Blackboard Jungle. But Morrow was not satisfied with simply standing in front of the camera. During the run of Combat, he also took on directing duties, giving himself another way to shape the stories he was telling. That ambition revealed something important about him. Morrow did not want to remain trapped inside the identity Hollywood had created for him. He wanted to understand filmmaking from another perspective and challenge himself creatively. And perhaps that is the most fascinating irony of his career. The actor, once chosen to play men audiences feared, had become the man millions of viewers trusted. For an entire generation, the image of Vic Morrow was no longer simply the dangerous young man from the blackboard jungle. It was Sergeant Chip Saunders, a soldier, a leader, a reluctant hero. And for Morrow himself, Combat proved something he had spent years trying to demonstrate. He was capable of being far more than the villain Hollywood first believed he was. But fame could not solve every problem in his life. Behind the uniform of Sergeant Saunders was a private man with a complicated family, difficult relationships, and a very different story waiting to be told. Part 5. When stardom was no longer enough. Vic Morrow wanted to be behind the camera. By the time Combat had established Vic Morrow as a familiar face on American television, he had already achieved something many actors spent their entire lives chasing. He was famous. Millions of viewers knew his face. He had a signature role, and he had earned recognition for his work. But for Morrow, fame was not enough. He did not want to spend the rest of his career simply repeating the success of Sergeant Chip Saunders. Perhaps he understood that even the most successful television role could eventually become another kind of prison. So he began looking for a new challenge. He wanted to direct. For Morrow, stepping behind the camera offered something acting could not: greater control over the story, the performances, and the way a scene was constructed. His experience directing episodes of Combat had already given him an opportunity to explore that side of filmmaking. But he wanted to go further. He eventually directed feature projects including Death Watch and A Man Called Sledge. The results, however, did not bring him the level of success he might have hoped for. This was another frustrating chapter in Morrow's career. He had already proven that he could become a television star. Yet becoming an important filmmaker in his own right proved much more difficult. Hollywood fame did not automatically translate into creative freedom. And so Morrow continued acting. He appeared in television productions and films throughout the 1970s, refusing to disappear after the end of Combat. His later work included Roots, the landmark 1977 television miniseries, where he took on another demanding role. He also appeared in The Bad News Bears, continuing to demonstrate that he was still capable of bringing intensity and authority to very different kinds of characters. But something remained unchanged. Morrow was still searching. He had escaped the image of the young villain from the blackboard jungle. He had become one of television's most recognizable war heroes. He had stepped behind the camera. And yet, perhaps in his own mind, he had not reached the artistic position he truly wanted. That may explain why he continued accepting new projects even after achieving considerable fame. He did not seem willing to settle. For Morrow, acting was not simply about becoming famous. It was about proving that he could continue evolving. Every new role was another opportunity. Every new production was another chance to show audiences, and perhaps himself, that there was still more he could do. And this makes the final chapter of his career especially poignant. When Morrow accepted a role in Twilight Zone, the movie, he was not a forgotten actor desperately trying to make a comeback. He was still working, still experimenting, still searching for challenging material, still trying to push himself beyond the boundaries that Hollywood had placed around him decades earlier. But he could not have known that this new project would become the final production of his life. And perhaps the cruelest irony was that his final character, Bill Connor, would once again begin as a deeply flawed and prejudiced man, another difficult character for Morrow to explore. Yet this time, the story offered something different, a chance for the character to change, a chance for Morrow to show another side of his talent, and, tragically, a chance he would never live to see completed. Part 6. Bill Connor, the final role that might have changed how the world saw Vic Morrow. In 1982, Vic Morrow accepted a role that seemed strangely familiar. He would play Bill Connor in Twilight Zone the movie, a man consumed by prejudice and hatred toward people he considered different from himself. In some ways, it was the kind of character Hollywood had been asking Morrow to play since the beginning of his career. Dangerous, angry, unpleasant, a man audiences were supposed to distrust. But this time, there was a crucial difference. Bill Connor was not going to remain the same man from beginning to end. Instead, the story would force him to experience the world from the other side. After expressing hateful views, Bill is mysteriously transported through different periods of history. Suddenly, he is no longer the person judging others. He becomes the person being judged. He experiences discrimination and persecution from the perspective of the very people he had once looked down upon. And slowly, something begins to change. The character is forced to confront the consequences of his own beliefs. That made Bill Connor a particularly interesting role for Morrow. For decades, he had fought against Hollywood's tendency to reduce him to a date. Now, in his final film role, he was playing a deeply flawed man who was being given an opportunity to change. Perhaps that was the most meaningful irony of all. Vic Morrow had spent his career trying to escape the villainous image Hollywood had placed upon him. And in his final role, his character was given the chance to become a better man. The final sequence was set against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. Bill finds himself in a terrifying situation where he encounters two young Vietnamese children. This time, however, he is not the aggressor. He is trying to protect them. The man who had once expressed hatred toward people different from himself is suddenly placed in a position where he must care for two vulnerable children. It was a dramatic reversal, and for an actor like Morrow, who had spent years portraying soldiers, criminals, tough men, and complicated characters, the scene offered another opportunity to explore something deeper: redemption. But the scene was also extraordinarily dangerous. The production planned to combine several difficult elements: night filming, explosions, a low-flying helicopter, and young performers. Every element had to work perfectly. There was very little room for error. And yet, as the night of filming approached, the people on the set could not know how profoundly this scene would change their lives. For Morrow, it was simply another day at work, another role, another scene he needed to complete, another opportunity to show what he could do. He could not know that this would be his final performance. He could not know that the character he was trying to bring to life would never reach the ending written for him. And he certainly could not know that, decades later, people would still debate how that scene was planned, who was responsible for the risks, and whether the tragedy could have been prevented. The cameras were ready, the helicopter was ready, the explosions were prepared, and Vic Morrow stepped into the darkness. What happened next would become one of the most haunting chapters in Hollywood history.